Active History is pleased to present a recording of Todd Webb's talk, Evangelicalism, Liberalism, and the Origins of the Lord's Dominion in Mid-Nineteenth Century Canada. The talk was given as part of The Other 60s, a decade that shaped Canada and the world, a symposium hosted by the Department of History at the University of Toronto. The talk was delivered on April 22nd, 2017.
As they gathered in St. James Church, Montreal for their annual meeting in 1852, the British Wesleyan missionaries stationed in Lower Canada could not escape their memories of the past 22 years, a time of interdenominational conflict that pitted the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Britain against the Canadian Methodists of Upper Canada. Fundamentally, the battles between these two churches had been about money and power. They had resulted in a union in 1833, the collapse of that union in 1840, and a reunion in 1847. In the end, the British Wesleyan missionaries in Lower Canada believed they had learned one key lesson, that the Canadian Methodists could not be trusted. And yet in May 1852, those same ministers received notice of a major change in British Wesleyan policy. Laboring under severe financial pressure, the Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society, stationed in London, England, was determined to cut its costs by reorganizing its work among the settler colonies of the empire. As part of that scheme, the British Wesleyan missionaries in Lower Canada would be folded into the mission work of the Canadian Methodist Church in Upper Canada. The idea of a federal union of the Methodism of British North America first arose among the Methodists in the Canadas in response to this crisis. That circumstance, like the later effort to achieve a political confederation in British North America, was rife with irony. The largest ironies of all in the Methodist case were that it was the British Wesleyan missionaries who came up with the idea of a federal union, and that they saw it as a way not to unite with the Methodists of Lower and Upper Canada, but to avoid a deeply troubling absorption into the ranks of Canadian Methodism. As was invariably the case when the Missionary Society and its agents disagreed, the Missionary Society won. In 1854, the British Wesleyan District of Lower Canada joined the Canadian Methodist Church in Upper Canada. All talk of a federal union of the Methodism of British North America ceased until it became a reality 20 years later. In 1874, the Canadian Methodist Church united with the British Wesleyans of the Maritimes, as well as a smaller Methodist group called the New Connection. Focusing on the Union of 1874, I'm going to try to answer what seems at first glance to be a straightforward question. How did this confederation of Methodist groups in the newly formed Dominion of Canada come about? Forces internal to the new nation certainly played a role in the process, but the Wesleyans of Britain also shaped the Union, just as they had in 1854. At the most basic level, the Union of 1874 could not have happened without the approval of the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Britain. It had the same relationship to the Canadian Methodist Church and the Maritime Wesleyans as the Parliament at Westminster had to the colonial governments of British North America before 1867. Equally important to the Union process, however, were changes among the Wesleyans in Britain, particularly the rise of a liberal faction within the ministry during the second half of the 19th century. That liberal group, and especially the preacher and administrator, William Morley Puncheon, made possible the formation of a Lord's Dominion alongside the newly and quickly expanding Canadian state. One way to demonstrate the importance of the rise of this liberal group in the British Wesleyan ministry would be to follow a typically conservative preacher to British North America at the beginning of the Union process. Just such a man traveled through the colonies during the humid summer of 1861. William Boyce described himself as both a moderate conservative and a liberal, though it is difficult to see where either his self-declared moderation or liberalism came into it. As he journeyed from St. John's to Toronto, Boyce recorded a series of observations about the state of Methodism in British North America that would have been familiar to most of the Tory leadership of the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Britain during the first half of the 19th century. William Boyce was sure that some form of union between the recently expanded Canadian Methodist Church and the Wesleyans in the Maritimes was desirable, provided it could be done right. A proper union would need to guard against any unreasonable fiscal demands that the frequently grasping colonials might make on the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Britain. At the same time, the union would have to protect what one of the secretaries of the Missionary Society called the soundness of Methodism of Canada. Boyce and his fellow Wesleyan Tories saw threats to the integrity of British North American Methodism coming from two directions. The first was the ever-present danger from what he called the bastard Methodism of the United States. And he sees this posing a danger what he calls the genuine English Methodism that the Missionary Society had spent years trying to plant in the colonies. Boyce found almost everything about the Americans distasteful, from their cheap literature to their appalling habit of spitting in public. He was relieved to see that most English immigrants to Upper Canada shared his disdain, but he was also sure that a crisis had arrived, that now was the time to save Methodism in the Canadas and the Maritimes from Yankeeism. The best way to achieve that would be to create a union that maintained and even strengthened the transoceanic bonds between Methodism in Britain and British North America. But even the strongest links across the Atlantic could not compete with the second threat that William Boyce detected. While in Toronto, he was visited by the Canadian-born Methodist minister James Spencer, whom Boyce described as a thorough, out-and-out radical and ultra-Canadian in his views. In a 2-hour-long tirade, Spencer demanded greater freedom for the Methodists of British North America. In that, he was one of a minority of preachers and laity who were becoming clannish, Boyce recorded. They would hold on to the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Britain to get all they can, he continued, and when nothing is to be gained, they will cut the rope. Boyce was not imagining this trend in British North American Methodism. James Spencer was a genuinely popular preacher, particularly among the younger ministers, having served as editor of the denominational newspaper, the Christian Guardian, from 1851 to 1860. He was also a thorough Canadian and a tireless agitator for democratic church government and the independence of colonial Methodism. Spencer had voted against the reunion of 1847, and by the 1860s was stating that the Methodists of British North America could manage their business better than any Wesleyan in Britain. Boyce wanted to crush the rebellious spirit of these uppity settlers with a preemptive strike. He would cut the rope that bound the British and British North American Methodists before Spencer and his supporters had the chance. In the event, the Wesleyans in Britain never had to make so drastic and openly hostile a move. James Spencer died in the autumn of 1863. His friends appeared to abandon their anti-British feelings, and by the late 1860s, prominent British Wesleyan ministers had developed a different approach to the rising nationalist impulses among their British North American brethren. It was that shift towards a more liberal attitude that made the Union of 1874 possible. The meaning of British Wesleyan liberalism was always relative. During the heyday of the ministerial autocrat and Tory Jabez Bunting in the 1830s and 1840s, to be a liberal was to be a subversive, bent on smashing up the church and introducing all sorts of democratic horrors, like lay representation into the annual all-ministerial governing conference. After the last major schism in the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Britain exhausted itself in the mid-1850s, the word liberal shed most of its conspiratorial associations among the preachers, particularly as more and more laity sided with William Gladstone's Liberal Party in its electoral contests with Disraeli's Conservatives. The advanced liberals in the British Wesleyan ministry slid ever further left in the 1870s and 1880s, following the lead of the dynamic Hugh Price Hughes until the liberal group among the preachers split over the issue of home rule for Ireland in the mid-1880s. On the whole, however, the liberals in the mid-19th century British Wesleyan ministry, like liberals across the British Isles, believed in the credo nicely summed up by the historian George Dangerfield as a combination of freedom, free trade, progress, and the seventh commandment, which is, thou shalt not commit adultery, in case you're not up on your commandments. During the 1860s and 1870s, one of the most influential of the British Wesleyan liberals was William Morley Puncheon. At the beginning of his ministerial career in 1849, Pynchon sought a way between Jabez Bunting's Wesleyan Toryism and the secessionist impulses of Bunting's critics. In a move typical of his fellow liberals, the young preacher refused to endorse the Great Schism of 1849, while also acknowledging that criticisms of Bunting's iron-fisted rule contained much deep and telling truth. Pynchon was willing to contemplate changes in the government of British Wesleyanism, even if those reforms had the potential to lessen clerical power. This version of liberalism may have been a pale reflection of its more radical denominational incarnations, but it was informed by a genuine appreciation for, and even more importantly, willingness to apply the tradition of the free-born Englishman. An accomplished preacher and lecturer, Pynchon spoke in favor of both political progress and its champions. Whether the chivalry of feudalism be extinct or not, he noted approvingly in 1854, there can be no question that the villeinage of feudalism is gone. Common men nowadays question the wisdom of nobilities, correct the errors of cabinets, and do not even listen obsequiously to catch the whispers of kings. Pynchon also praised the early liberal statesman and historian Thomas Babington Macaulay, particularly the sturdy independence and consistent love of liberty that, Pynchon claimed, Macaulay had inherited from his evangelical parents. In 1861, Pynchon and several like-minded preachers brought those same values to a new denominational newspaper, the Methodist Recorder. A popular journal among ministry and laity alike, it was nevertheless cagey on the increasingly pressing issue of lay representation. But as we will see, Pynchon at least embraced its necessity, and he's following the implications of his liberal leanings to their logical conclusion. When I say lay representation, as I sort of alluded to before, what I mean is up to this point, no laity are allowed to take part in the government of the church. Now they want to introduce laity into the actual, what's called the annual conference, the annual gathering of all the Methodist ministers. In 1868, following a request from the Methodists in central Canada, the British Wesleyans appointed William Morley Pynchon to the presidency of the Canadian Church. As he prepared to cross the ocean, the secretaries of the Missionary Society drafted a set of instructions to guide his actions. The letter reflected the thoughts of these Wesleyan Tories, who still dominated much of the machinery of the British Church. It also demonstrated that their thinking about Methodism in Canada hadn't changed much in the 7 years since William Boyce's tour. The secretaries remained hopeful that the financial resources of Canada would soon allow their brethren overseas to prosecute the work of Methodism without pecuniary aid from England. At the same time, the secretaries cautiously noted that while the Dominion created in 1867 was a notable achievement, there was no way to know if it would prove a stable arrangement. In other words, there was no helpful analogy to be made between a political and a religious union in North America. Instead, it was important to continue and strengthen the bonds between the Wesleyans in Britain and the Methodists of central Canada and the Maritimes. A reorganization of all the Methodist churches in the Dominion was still a hasty and premature course, given the dangers it could pose to Wesleyan purity. With that in mind, the secretaries instructed Pynchon to keep a lid on any talk of uniting with the breakaway groups like the New Connection, with its policy of lay representation. That democratic innovation was beyond the bounds of Wesleyan Methodism, smacking as it did of the worst excesses of American Methodism. Pynchon arrived in Canada in the spring of 1868, charged with increasing the financial resources of its Methodist churches while maintaining an ecclesiastical status quo. He certainly worked hard to achieve the first goal. At the same time, he also shared the worry that the Tory secretaries of the Missionary Society expressed about the threats to Methodist purity in Canada. In particular, he was wary of the American influence in the country, whether in secular or sacred terms. He might praise individual Americans. He seems to have been quite a big fan of General Grant, but Pynchon was unimpressed with American society and culture as a whole, complaining about the wretched bile of the press and the Yankee obsession with nationalist tub thumping. Pynchon made his anti-American views clear in an address at Manchester's Free Trade Hall in 1871. He urged his British listeners not to sacrifice Canadian interests for the sake of the friendship of so untrustworthy a nation as the United States. In his words, that political Ahab, who although his possessions are already unwieldy, often casts a very loving and longing look towards the acquisition of Naboth's vineyard. The Yankees are very vexed with me, Pynchon wrote a few months later, but they are just doing the same thing in that new raid at Manitoba, which is a reference to the last of the Fenian raids. Pynchon was no more impressed with American Methodism. Like William Boyce before him, he was worried about the Methodist ministry in Canada being drawn into its sphere of influence. As he warned in 1875, there were some Canadian preachers whose Anglophobia I have often deplored and whose American proclivities would yet plague Methodism in central Canada. Such anti-Americanism had little effect, however, on Pynchon's response to the union movement among the Methodists of the Dominion. Instead of suppressing talk of ecclesiastical change in the colonies, as the Wesleyan Tories urged, Pynchon embraced his liberal ideals, successfully positioning himself as a mediator among the Methodists of central Canada, the Maritime Wesleyans, and the representatives of the New Connection. And instead of trying to bind the Methodists in Canada more tightly to the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Britain, Pynchon embraced the Canadian nationalist impulses that Confederation had inspired amongst the colonial ministry. Pynchon himself shared the rhetoric of the Canadians, describing the projected union as a Methodist confederation. And while he did sometimes worry that the Canadian ministers were hurrying it rather too much, he also felt sure that it must be tried. Pynchon went even further, arguing that his various efforts in British North America would increase the nationalism of his Canadian brethren, transforming their church into a great power in this dominion for ages to come. Methodism here is no small thing, he explained to one of his British correspondents, and must be an important element in the future history of the Dominion. In a word, Pynchon believed that the time had come not to cut the rope between British Wesleyan and Canadian Methodism, but to create a Lord's Dominion within the political Dominion created in 1867. That was the only way he felt for Methodism in Canada to fulfill its true destiny. Unlike the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Britain, a united Methodism in Canada could truly embrace sturdy independence and liberty, stepping out from under the long legal shadow of the Church of England. As Pynchon put it in his speech at Free Trade Hall, Canadian Methodism might soon take the position which she ought always to take among the churches, standing forth in her comeliness, the peer of all, too affluent in spirit and resources to be the poor relation of any. Of course, before that happy moment could arrive, the Methodists in Canada had to find a way around the vexed issue of lay representation. In the union negotiations, the representatives of the New Connection made it clear that any new ecclesiastical arrangement was conditional on the Central Canadian Methodists and the Maritime Wesleyans agreeing to admit lay delegates to the governing conference. That was just what the secretaries of the Missionary Society had feared, of course. And at their annual meeting in 1872, a majority of the British Wesleyan ministers stated that they were simply not prepared to approve any scheme of union which may confer equal power on ministers and laymen. A year later, however, those same preachers agreed to rescind the Articles of Union which now subsist between the Church in Britain and the conferences of Canada and the Maritimes, freeing them to merge with the New Connection and to embrace lay representation. This was one of the most stunning reversals in the long history of British Wesleyan Canadian Methodist relations. This request from the Methodists in Canada came at the right time, both for their own union efforts and for the British Wesleyan liberals. In 1873, the conservatives in the British Wesleyan ministry remained convinced that lay representation on either side of the Atlantic was a complete non-starter. By that point, however, they were fighting a rearguard action against liberals like William Morley Pynchon, who as early as 1871 had become convinced that some measure of lay representation should not be allowed to defeat church union. It's likely that Pynchon's fellow liberals supported lay representation in Canada in 1873 as part of their larger effort to achieve some measure of it in the British Wesleyan Church. When he returned to Britain in 1873, Pynchon certainly threw himself into that effort. It was an anxious and prayerful time, he remarked, particularly since, in the past, questions of ministerial and lay power had blown the Wesleyan Church apart. But in 1876, after a splendid debate, lay representation became a reality in the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Britain, just as it had in Canada 2 years earlier. Indeed, the Canadian example may have played a role in achieving that goal. In October 1874, the organ of the British Wesleyan Tories, the Watchman, published a communication from a Canadian preacher, pointing out that the newly created Methodist Church in Canada had gracefully conceded to the wishes of its laity. The results had been reassuring, the correspondent added, with the lay representatives being, if anything, more averse to reckless innovation than the preachers. It was a message that was bound to comfort the less adventurous of the British Wesleyan preachers. So to conclude very briefly, as complex and dense as they might be, the origins and history of the Union of 1874 point to an important confluence of personalities and events in Canada and Britain, one that eventually led to a greater degree of democracy in both churches. In a fine example of the interconnectedness of transatlantic Methodism before the British and Canadian churches went their separate ways, the Lord's Dominion, ushered into existence by the British Wesleyan Liberals, aided the triumph of those ministers in turn. Thank you.
You've been listening to a recording of Todd Webb's talk, Evangelicalism, Liberalism, and the Origins of the Lord's Dominion in Mid-Nineteenth Century Canada. The talk was given as part of the Other 60s, a decade that shaped Canada and the world, a symposium hosted by the Department of History at the University of Toronto. The talk was delivered on April 22nd, 2017. You can find recordings of other talks at ActiveHistory.ca.